Sometime around 1977, millions of children around the world started doing something that had never happened at this scale before. They came home from school. They unlocked their own front door, they walked into a completely empty house, and they took care of themselves. No parent, no safety net, no one checking if they were okay. Those children grew up. They're your co-workers who never complain, your managers who solve every problem before you even knew there was one, the people who figured out the internet before anyone else, and then never once posted about their breakfast. Psychology has spent decades studying boomers. Millennials have been analysed to death. Gen Z is treated like a fascinating new species that needs to be understood before it is too late. But the generation that came home to the empty house, they're still waiting to be understood. Generation X, born between 1965 and 1980. The generation psychology forgot to study. If you are watching this and those years sound like yours, or you are watching this because someone in your life was born in those years and you've never quite been able to figure them out, this video is for you. In the next 21 minutes, I am going to walk you through the psychology behind everything that makes Generation X different from every other living generation. Not better, not worse, different in ways that are specific, measurable, and once you understand them, make complete sense. Why they can't ask for help even when they need it badly. Why a job title means absolutely nothing to them. Why they built emotional walls that nobody asked them to build. And why, right now, today they are quietly grieving something that most people haven't even noticed is gone. Let's start where it all began, with an empty house and what silence does to a child's developing brain. By 1984, approximately 7 million children in the United States alone between the ages of 5 and 13 were regularly unsupervised after school, and that was just one country. 7 million. That number matters because what happened in those empty houses wasn't neglect in the way we think about neglect today. It was something more complicated. It was an entire generation learning at the neurological level that the world does not stop and wait for you. Close your eyes for a second. It is 1981. You are 9 years old. The school bus drives away. You walk up to your front door, reach into the front pocket of your backpack, past the homework, past the crumpled lunch bag, and you pull out a key on a string. You let yourself in. The house is quiet, not peaceful, quiet, empty quiet. You know the rules. Homework done before anything else. Don't open the door for strangers. Don't tell anyone you are home alone. Have something started for dinner by 5. Nobody handed you those rules in a handbook. You figured them out, because figuring things out, that was just what you did. Here is what was actually happening inside those children's brains. And this is the part most people don't know. When a child is regularly left alone in an environment where they must monitor for danger and solve problems independently, the brain responds by elevating baseline cortisol, the stress hormone the body prepares. It stays alert. But here is the counterintuitive part. The brain adapts. After repeated exposure, the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for consequence prediction, risk assessment, and long-term decision, making develops faster and stronger than in children who are constantly supervised. The brain makes a calculation. Adults aren't reliably here, so I have to be my own adult. This is not a metaphor. This is measurable neurodevelopment, and it is why Generation X, by the age of 10, was making decisions that many adults today struggle with at 30. And for many Gen X kids, it wasn't just themselves they were responsible for. Older siblings became default parents. At 9, 10, 11 years old, they were picking up younger brothers and sisters from the bus stop, making sure the homework got done, starting dinner, parenting a child while still being a child themselves. Psychology has a name for this, parentification, and while researchers typically frame it as harmful, Gen X experienced a version of it that produced something different, competence at scale. They didn't just learn to care for themselves, they learned to care for others, quietly, without complaint, without waiting to be thanked. That pattern is still running. Right now, 40 years later, there is one more piece of this that almost every conversation about Gen X forgets. Their grandparents were the greatest generation. People who had survived the Depression, who had fought in World War II, whose baseline understanding of hardship made almost everything else look manageable by comparison. These were not grandparents who celebrated participation trophies. They were grandparents who taught skills, who fixed things, who sat a child down and said, "Here is how you do it," and meant it as love. Gen X received something rare. They were raised by parents who were trying to be modern, but shaped by grandparents who were ancient in the best possible way. Post-war grit passed down through one generation. No generation after them received that inheritance. The empty house made them self-reliant, but self-reliance, taken far enough, becomes something else entirely. It becomes the inability to ask for help, even when the house is full, even when the people you love are standing right there. That is next. There is a term in psychology that describes a very specific pattern of behavior, a person who is exceptionally capable, highly functional, reliable in every crisis, and completely structurally unable to reach out when they themselves are struggling. It is called compulsive self-reliance. John Bowlby, one of the founders of attachment theory, identified it decades ago. He described it as what happens when a child learns repeatedly and without exception that the people who should come don't. The child eventually stops expecting them, and then, crucially, they stop expecting anyone. Research published in the Journal of Adult Development found that Generation X reports significantly lower rates of seeking social support during periods of stress. Not because they lack people they could ask, but because asking to the Gen X brain registers as failure, as proof that the self-reliance they spent their entire childhood building wasn't enough. Here is the Gen X paradox that almost no one talks about. They will show up for you completely, without drama, without a single post about it, at 2 in the morning if you need them. But they will not call you when they are drowning. Not because they don't trust you, because asking for help feels like losing, and Gen X does not lose. They also developed a second defense, one that looks from the outside like personality. Gen X turned irony into armor before irony was fashionable. They grew up under the shadow of nuclear war. Their teachers conducted duck and cover drills while simultaneously telling children not to worry. Adults spoke about the end of civilization as casually as they discussed the weather. When you grow up in that environment, you learn something important very early. If you make the joke first, the situation can't make it for you. You stay one step ahead of the pain, expect nothing, and you'll never be disappointed. That isn't nihilism. That is a survival strategy built and refined over decades. But here is something the conversation about Generation X almost always skips. They had an emotional outlet. They didn't process their feelings on social media. They didn't have therapy, speak, or vulnerability culture, or carefully curated stories about their inner lives. They had music. The mixtape wasn't just a gift. It was an emotional confession in song form. The only socially acceptable way to say this is how I feel about you without the terrifying vulnerability of saying it out loud. The hours spent with a pencil rewinding a tape, waiting by the radio, finger on the record button, hoping the DJ wouldn't talk over the beginning. That physical investment meant something. Music that costs you time and attention becomes something different than music that arrives in half a second, on demand. This is why the Gen X musical era is considered by many critics to be the last truly authentic one in mainstream culture. It wasn't manufactured for streaming algorithms. It carried the emotional weight of a generation that had nowhere else to put it. And there is one more thing this generation built that almost no analysis ever mentions. Patience, not the passive kind. The kind that gets trained into you by a world that simply does not offer instant delivery. You waited a week for the next episode of the show. You waited for photographs to be developed, sometimes 7 days, not knowing whether a single one of them came out. You waited for your friends to show up because you had no way to know if they were coming until they actually knocked on the door. Psychologists studying delayed gratification have found something consistent across decades of research. The ability to tolerate waiting without an immediate reward is one of the strongest predictors of long-term outcomes, academic success, financial stability, the quality of relationships. Generation X didn't practice delayed gratification as a discipline. It was just Tuesday. The armor protected them. The patience shaped them. The dark humour kept the world at exactly the right distance, but none of this appeared from nowhere. All of it was a response to something specific, to decades of watching the people in charge promise things they could never actually deliver, and that response produced something that, in any professional setting, is either the most valuable thing in the room or the most uncomfortable. A built-in, lifetime, calibrated detector for bullshit. There is a line that appears in some version in almost every comment section of every video ever made about Generation X. I don't have a problem with authority. I have a problem with bullshit. That isn't attitude. That isn't a personality quirk or a generational chip on the shoulder. That is a conclusion, reached carefully through decades of observable, documented, personal evidence that authority figures, when given unchecked power, consistently, reliably disappoint. Let's be specific about what Gen X actually watched happen, whether you grew up in America, Britain, Australia, or anywhere else. The story was the same. The names were different, the scandals were different, but the pattern was identical. Authority figures given power disappointed. In the United States, it was Watergate, a president who lied to an entire nation on tape, and institutions that had to be dragged slowly and reluctantly into accountability. It was Iran, Contra. Senior officials who broke the law were caught and faced almost no consequences. It was the AIDS crisis, a public health emergency ignored for years, while people died because the people dying were politically inconvenient to acknowledge. In the UK, it was political scandals and coal mine closures that destroyed entire communities overnight. In Australia, corporate collapses that wiped out workers who had given 30 years. Across Europe, governments that promised one thing and delivered another. And everywhere, corporate loyalty was the great lie of their parents' generation. Their fathers and mothers gave decades to companies. Those companies responded with mass layoffs, restructuring, and the quiet lesson that loyalty, given upward, is a transaction that does not pay. The message received over and over again until it became neurological. Institutions lie. Titles protect people who don't deserve protecting. The only thing you can actually trust is what you can see someone do. This is why Generation X respects competence, not credentials. If you have earned your position through actual demonstrated skill, they will follow you anywhere without complaint. If you are someone with an impressive title who doesn't know what you are doing, they have zero patience. Not because they're difficult, because they've been watching the consequences of incompetent authority since childhood, and they have no interest in repeating the experience. But there is a deeper layer to this that most analyses of Gen X miss entirely. It isn't just distrust, it is a specific kind of intelligence, one that was trained into them by a world that required effort to understand. Before Google made every answer available in less than a second, knowledge was physical. It required going somewhere. A library, a card catalogue, those physical wooden drawers, each one representing hours of someone's careful indexing work, and then hunting, methodically, through stacks of books for the one that might contain the answer you needed. Cognitive psychologists have a name for what happens when you acquire information this way. They call it effortful encoding. Information that costs you something. Time, physical effort, frustration, persistence becomes more permanently integrated into memory. It becomes part of how you think, not just something you happen to know. Generation X didn't just accumulate facts, they built a relationship with the process of finding truth. Which is why, when someone presents them with an easy answer to a complex question, their first instinct is not to accept it. It is to ask, what did it cost you to find this? And if the answer is nothing, why should I trust it? On top of all of this, on top of the institutional distrust, the learned skepticism, the calibrated radar for anything that doesn't add up, Generation X got hit economically at every single stage of their adult lives. The youngest Gen, XRs, graduated college directly into the dot-com bubble burst. The oldest were hitting their financial stride when the 2008 financial crisis wiped out savings and home equity overnight. And now, in what should be their peak earning years, they are navigating a post-pandemic economy and a housing market that behaves like it was designed to exclude the people who played by the rules. They have been economically traumatized at entry, at mid-career, and at the peak. This is why they maintain multiple income streams. Not because they're entrepreneurial by nature, because they've learned through repeated, personal, expensive experience. That nothing lasts. They can't control whether a company will lay them off, but they can control whether they're the most valuable person in the room when the layoffs happen. That is not pessimism. That is a strategy built on evidence. All of this, the empty houses, the armor, the music, the patience, the calibrated distrust of every institution that ever failed them. It shaped how they work. It shaped how they think, how they lead, how they move through the world. But it also shaped how they parent. And this is where it gets complicated, because Generation X made a decision, consciously or not, to give their children everything they didn't have. And now some of them lie awake at night, wondering if they gave too much. Generation X parented with intention, deliberate, conscious, effortful intention. They gave their children the emotional presence they themselves never had, the supervision, the communication. They went to the games, they asked about the friendships. They said, "I love you," without waiting for a special occasion. They gave their children everything the empty house never gave them. And somewhere, in the back of their minds, a quiet question started forming. Did we make them too comfortable? Did we sand down all the edges? The edges that, when I hit them at 9 years old alone in an empty house, made me exactly who I am. This is not a criticism of their children. It is something more complex. A parent who knows, from personal experience, in their body, that struggle built them, holding the instinct to protect their child from that same struggle, while also knowing quietly what protection costs. Generation X holds a position in history that will never exist again. They had a fully analog childhood, real boredom, not the kind you cure with a screen in 30 seconds, but the deep, productive kind that forces your imagination to invent something. Real freedom gone until the streetlights came on. No GPS, no way for anyone to know exactly where you were. Real consequences, with no permanent digital record. And then they grew up and mastered the digital world entirely. They didn't just adapt to it. Many of them built it. They are fluent in both worlds. They can survive without technology because they spent their entire childhood without it. And they understand technology because they learned it as thinking adults. Not as infants handed a tablet before they could speak. That combination, analog roots, full digital fluency, the ability to live in either world, ended with their generation. It will not happen again. Right now, today, Generation X is carrying something that no one is keeping track of. They are providing tech support to their boomer parents while simultaneously explaining social media to their Gen Z children. They are the middle managers holding institutional knowledge that no one thought to document before the people who had it retired. They are the ones who show up, solve the problem, do the work, and leave before anyone thinks to say thank you. One woman described what her manager told her recently. She said she values my independence and reliability, that when she gives me a task, she doesn't hear from me again until it is finished and done. The woman who received that compliment said it felt completely normal. That is Generation X in 4 words, completely normal to them. Here is something that rarely gets said out loud about Generation X. They are grieving, not loudly, not with vigils or viral posts or public declarations, the way they do everything, quietly, without making a fuss. Sometimes wondering if it even counts as grief if you don't say it. They are grieving an era, a way of childhood that is gone and will not return. The version of freedom that existed when you could disappear on your bike for 6 hours and nobody worried because nobody could worry. There was no way to check. The kind of boredom that wasn't a problem to be solved with stimulation, but a space where your imagination discovered what it was actually capable of. The privacy that wasn't a setting you adjusted, but simply the condition of being alive, where if you made a mistake, a small number of people knew and time took care of the rest. They know what was lost because they lived it. They can describe the exact sound of the neighborhood going quiet in the summer evening. They remember what it felt like to wait a full week for something and to feel when it finally arrived that the waiting had made it real in a way that instant delivery cannot. They watch their children growing up in a world where nothing requires waiting, nothing is private, everything is documented. And they don't know how to explain what the loss feels like, because to explain it would require admitting they're sad about something that most people haven't even noticed is gone. So they don't say it. They just carry it. There is a metaphor that fits Generation X so precisely it almost hurts. They are a bridge between the analog world and the digital one, between post-war values and modern uncertainty, between parents who were too busy to watch and children they couldn't stop watching, between a generation that believed completely in institutions and a generation that has never trusted them. Bridges don't get attention. Nobody drives across a bridge and thinks about the engineering. Nobody stops in the middle to acknowledge what it took to build it. You only think about the bridge when it isn't there anymore, when you are standing at the edge of something you cannot cross alone. Generation X is already past the midpoint of their lives. The children who came home to empty houses in 1978 are in their 50s. Now, the kids who wore their keys on strings around their necks are grandparents. And at some point, sooner than any of us are ready to think about, the bridge will be gone, and the people on both sides will look at the gap and wonder how they ever got across. If you are Generation X, you just heard someone say out loud what you have felt quietly, without language, for a very long time. You deserve to be understood. You still do. If you are not Generation X, you just understood something about the person in your life who came home to an empty house and never quite stopped being the child who learned to be their own parent. Drop your birth year in the comments. I want to know who is here. And next week, we go inside the psychology of why Generation X literally cannot ask for help, even when they're drowning, and what it is costing them in their relationships, their health, and their lives. Subscribe so you don't miss it. And if this hit home, share it with someone who deserves to finally be understood.